He thought it would be easy. He thought it would be another room he could dominate, another stage he could command, another opponent he could rattle into silence. He was wrong. What unfolded that evening in front of a live audience and rolling cameras wasn't the spectacle Donald Trump had engineered in his mind when he pointed across the stage and issued his challenge. It was something quieter, more precise, and ultimately far more damaging to him than any shouting match could have been. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't fight him. She simply answered. And that turned out to be worse for him than anything else she could have done. By the time the third question landed, the energy in the room had completely reversed. Trump, who had opened the evening as the aggressor, the man in control, the figure everyone had come to watch, was sitting back in his chair looking for solid ground. And Crockett, calm and unhurried, was doing what she'd spent her entire career doing, making the truth unavoidable. This is how it happened. The venue was the kind of place that amplifies tension. A large auditorium, bright stage lighting that makes every expression visible from every angle. A packed house that hadn't come for pleasantries. Journalists, policy observers, community leaders, and ordinary Americans who'd managed to secure a seat. They were all there for something real. Whether they'd get it was another question. The event had been organized as a structured political forum, moderated, formatted, predictable in the way these things usually are. Talking points would be deployed, applause lines would land, and everyone would go home having heard what they expected to hear. That was the design. Trump disrupted the design early. He'd been in typical form during the opening portion, assertive, rhythmic in that way he has of building sentences like he's dropping weights onto a scale, each one adding to a pile he expects the audience to feel. He was working the room, making contact with the energy in it, feeding off the attention, and then, in a moment that nobody in the production team had scripted, he turned toward Jasmine Crockett and issued an open challenge. Direct, pointed, and with the full weight of someone who expected the other person to blink. She didn't blink. Crockett looked at him with the composed steadiness of a person who has been in high-pressure rooms before. Real ones, not just political ones. Courtrooms. Holding cells. Conversations with people whose futures hung on the next few words. She met his stare and told him simply that she'd been ready. The room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The moderator, now navigating uncharted territory, made the call to proceed. Whatever this evening was supposed to be, it was now something else. The first question was deceptively simple. What does it actually mean to fight for ordinary Americans? 4 words with 1,000 possible answers, and the one that mattered was the one that rang true. Trump answered first. He leaned into it the way he always leans into things, with ownership, with certainty, with the implicit suggestion that the answer to every question is already sitting in his corner. He ran through the familiar inventory. Jobs restored, borders secured, taxes reduced, foreign adversaries put on notice. His framing was consistent with everything he'd ever said about himself. That his record speaks, that results are what count, that he didn't sit in committees crafting language while the country was burning. There was a version of that argument that worked. Parts of the crowd responded to it. The cadence was practiced, the confidence unwavering. But then, Crockett began to speak. She didn't match his energy. She didn't try to. She started in a low, even voice that somehow made people lean forward rather than sit back. And what she said wasn't a rebuttal to his points. It was a different definition of the entire conversation. She said that fighting for people means showing up in the moments nobody photographs. That it means being present, not when the cameras are rolling, but when someone needs someone and there's nobody else in the room. She talked about where she came from, not as a biographical footnote, but as the source material for everything she understood about what struggle actually felt like. A mother working back-to-back shifts at a hospital, classmates with everything it took to succeed who never got a fair path forward. A neighborhood that saw politicians when election season arrived and otherwise felt invisible. And then, she said, what may have been the defining line of the first exchange. You say you fought for the people, but you fought from the top. I've been fighting from the bottom. It wasn't delivered as a takedown, it was delivered as a statement of fact. And that made it hit harder than any insult. The room went quiet, and the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that can't be efficiently processed and moved past. Trump, who built an entire political identity on having an answer for everything, didn't have a natural response. There was nothing to refute. She hadn't attacked him. She'd simply drawn a line and made clear which side of it she was standing on. She talked about her years as a public defender, not the title, not the credential, the daily experience of it. Sitting across from people at their lowest point, being the only thing standing between a scared young person and a system that wasn't designed to see their humanity. Fighting, case by case, with no audience and no applause, because that's what the job required. You don't earn the title of fighter by being the loudest voice in the room, she said. You earn it by showing up when the cost is real. The crowd wasn't loud after that. They were still. And in the context of a political event, that kind of stillness is far more significant than applause. The second question went deeper. Describe a moment when your integrity was genuinely tested. Real stakes, real consequences. This was the question designed to separate the rehearsed from the real. You can't prepare a convincing answer to this one. You either have something true to say or you don't. Trump answered with the investigations, the legal challenges, the political pressure, what he characterized as coordinated efforts to dismantle him. He said that most people in his position would have walked away, that the pressure was designed to make someone fold. He framed his persistence as the definition of integrity, the refusal to quit even when everything was stacked against him. There was a constituency in the room for that answer, and they responded to it. But the response was measured, not explosive. People were listening differently now than they had been 30 minutes earlier. Something in how Crockett had handled the first question had recalibrated the room's expectations. She began her answer quietly. She said that her integrity had been tested long before she ever set foot in a congressional hearing room. She described a client, 17 years old, charged with armed robbery, the evidence thin enough that any honest prosecutor should have hesitated. But the system wasn't in a hesitating mood. It wanted a resolution, a number to add to a statistic, a case closed. The deal on the table was a decade of this kid's life. If he declined and went to trial, the risk was 3 times that. He looked across the table at his young lawyer and asked her to tell him what to do. She paused there in the story. Let the room sit with the image of that for a moment. She told him the truth. She said that if he didn't do it, they were going to fight it. Not because the odds were good, not because it was the safe professional call, but because integrity doesn't have a contingency clause for when things get difficult. She said she knew she might lose. She knew she'd carry the weight of that outcome. But she also knew that standing with someone when they have no one else, that's not optional. It's the whole point. They went to trial. They won. And she mentioned, simply and without drama, that the young man still reaches out to say thank you. The auditorium stayed perfectly silent. Trump attempted a recovery. He acknowledged the story, he could hardly do otherwise, but suggested that the presidency required operating at a scale that made individual cases feel small by comparison. Countries, armies, economies. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She simply asked, if you've never had to carry the weight of one person's life depending entirely on your decision, how do you prepare to carry the weight of millions? It wasn't a rhetorical flourish. It was a genuine question. And Trump didn't answer it. The third question was the one that broke the evening open completely. What would you say to a working-class family that's lost faith in both political parties? Trump moved fast, probably sensing that he needed to reestablish some momentum. He went straight to the economic argument: lower costs, more jobs, borders controlled, global respect restored. He was speaking directly to a demographic he'd spent years cultivating, and the words were fluent and familiar. The argument was, I delivered once. I can deliver again. It was not an unreasonable pitch. It was the pitch he'd been making for years, and that had, at various points, worked. But Crockett's response was what nobody in that room will forget. She didn't deny that people were tired. She agreed with it immediately. And then she added 3 words that recontextualized the entire question: tired of being lied to. And then she built an image, not a statistic, not a policy position, but a picture of an actual family. In Texas, because that's where she's from, and those are the people she can describe from memory rather than a briefing document. 2 jobs between the adults in the household. Health insurance as a concept, not a reality. The math of the monthly budget coming up short in ways that no amount of discipline could fix. Medication or groceries, the kind of decision that shouldn't exist in the wealthiest country in the history of human civilization, but does. She talked about a factory closure that had followed promises about saving American manufacturing. She talked about schools losing the funding that was supposed to be protected. She talked about what it meant to need help and discover that the person who had made the most noise about fighting for you was in a different zip code entirely, playing golf. Trump tried to interrupt. He said it wasn't true. She looked at him and said, "This isn't something I read in a report. This is what people tell me in living rooms, on front porches, in hospital waiting rooms. I haven't needed a private jet to understand this. I've lived close enough to it to know." She was no longer debating. She was testifying. And there is no effective counter-argument to testimony. You can argue with statistics. You can challenge interpretations. You cannot argue with someone who is telling you what they've seen with their own eyes. She said that what working-class families actually wanted, underneath all the slogans and the culture war noise and the endless cycle of outrage, was something much simpler and much harder to deliver. Clean water, streets where their kids were safe, work that paid fairly and came with dignity, and a president who remembered they existed between election cycles. They want someone who sees them, she said, not someone who sees their own reflection in every room they walk into. That sentence landed somewhere specific. You could see it in the room, in the way people shifted, not toward her or away from Trump, but internally. The kind of shift that happens when something articulates what you've been feeling but haven't had words for. Trump didn't respond. He reached for his water glass and put it back down without drinking. He adjusted his posture. He looked at the moderator. For the first time that evening, the stage felt too large for him. He had issued the challenge that started all of this. He had invited Jasmine Crockett into a direct confrontation, confident that he could manage it, confident that she was in his league of performance and that he'd outperform her. But she wasn't performing. She was doing something else entirely. She was being honest about things that were true, and honesty at that specific level, the level of lived experience, of cases with names attached, of families she'd actually sat across from, doesn't have a counterpunch. The only person who can defeat that kind of testimony is someone with testimony of their own. Trump didn't have it, not on those terms. The final question was the most personal. What do you want people to remember about you after tonight? Trump went first. His answer was, in its way, consistent and authentic to who he is. He spoke about fighting, about having taken on forces that would have crushed other people, about choosing to enter the arena when he didn't have to. He said he'd made America respected, that he'd do it again. He looked into the camera with the full weight of someone who has never doubted his own narrative. The applause was sparse, not hostile, just restrained. The room wasn't hostile to him, it was just no longer fully with him. Then Crockett answered. She said she wanted to be remembered for listening, not for winning a debate, not for the clever moment or the quotable line, for having genuinely listened to the people who weren't in the room, who never had access to rooms like this one, whose problems didn't have enough political leverage attached to them to make it onto anyone's priority list. She talked about her own starting point without making it a victim narrative. She'd been underestimated. She'd had doors close in her face. She'd navigated a world that wasn't built with her in mind. But none of that was the point of the story. The point was that she kept going not because of what it would do for her, but because of who was waiting on the other side of it. Someone out there needed someone like her to stand up. That was the engine. She said she didn't have every answer. She didn't pretend that she did, but she made one promise that was unconditional. I will never put my name above the people. And then she said something that functioned as the quiet conclusion to the entire evening. Not just her final answer, but a summation of everything that had played out in that room over the previous 2 hours. When the cameras go off and the spin starts, she said, I want you to remember that there's a fundamental difference between a performer and a public servant. One lives for applause, the other lives for accountability. She leaned back. She was done. Trump didn't say anything. He didn't try to reclaim the floor or add a postscript. He sat with his hands folded, his expression unreadable. For a man who has built an entire identity on having the last word, the silence was its own kind of answer. After the moderator closed the event, the audience didn't leave quickly. They filed out with the slow pace of people who have just witnessed something they're still processing, something they need a little extra time to convert into language they can use when they describe it later. What they had seen wasn't a typical debate win. Typical debate wins happen when one side scores more points, delivers more effective lines, generates more applause. That kind of win is measurable. You can replay the highlight clips and run the comparison. This was different. What Jasmine Crockett had done wasn't defeat Donald Trump on the scoreboard of political combat. She had done something harder and rarer. She had introduced a different standard for measurement, not who sounded most powerful, but who was telling the truth, and how close that truth was to the actual experience of actual people. And measured against that standard, the contrast wasn't close. Trump arrived at that stage with decades of experience dominating public space. He knew how to read a room, how to work a crowd, how to build a moment and ride it. Those skills are real. They've taken him further than most people imagined they could. But they work best when the audience is in a particular mode, when they're looking for performance, for energy, for the rush of someone saying the things that feel satisfying to hear. When the audience shifts into a different mode, when they're looking for something true, for something that connects to their actual experience of the world, those same skills become a liability. They read as performance in a room that wanted substance. Crockett never tried to outperform him. She brought a different currency to the exchange entirely: specificity. Grounded experience. The quiet authority that comes not from position or wealth or attention, but from having actually done the work in the places where it needed doing. She had sat across from a terrified 17-year-old and told him they were going to fight. She had knocked on doors in neighborhoods that elected officials drove past. She had had the conversations that don't happen at fundraisers, in the real houses where real problems lived. And when someone carries that into a room, you can't argue with it. You can talk over it. You can dismiss it. You can try to change the subject. But you can't actually argue with it, because it isn't an opinion. It's a record. Trump had issued the challenge. He had opened the door to a direct, unscripted confrontation, confident that the terms of the exchange would favor him. What he hadn't accounted for was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't operating on his terms. She wasn't there to outshout him or outmaneuver him or win the performance. She was there to tell the truth. And in that particular room, on that particular evening, the truth was enough. He challenged her, and she showed him something he hadn't prepared for. Not a better performer. A different kind of person altogether. The kind whose strength doesn't come from the room's reaction. It comes from everything that happened before she walked into the room. The cases, the courtrooms, the front porches, the faces she can still see when she closes her eyes. That's not something you learn at a podium. It's not something you rehearse. It's not something you can challenge your way into owning. You either have it or you don't. And sitting across from a woman who had spent her life earning it, in front of a room that could feel the difference, Donald Trump found out which category he was in. By the third question, he knew he'd made a mistake. By the end of the night, everyone else did too.